Well, hello again, and welcome to the Live Wire on Inside UNC Charlotte. Thank you for joining us. And today our topic is, generally put, we're going to talk about guns on campus, but specifically we're talking about newly revised statute at the state level here in North Carolina, and then as of this week, updated UNC Charlotte policy related to guns or weapons on campus. And joining us today as our guest is the person on campus who understands university policy perhaps better than anybody, Dave Broome, who is our Vice Chancellor for Legal Affairs and UNC Charlotte's General Counsel. Dave, welcome to the Live Wire, and thanks for doing this with us.
Oh, glad to be here, Stephen.
All right, well, and as a way of getting started, let's just talk a little bit first about you and your role. Here at the university, we do have an Office of Legal Affairs, and would you describe that as an active office, or?
We have plenty to keep us busy. We do. I can't tell you how many people I run into that are shocked to find out that the university has any lawyers. We, in fact, have 5, counting myself. We also have a paralegal, and I have an executive assistant. So it's a small legal office, but I think pretty effective and well suited to help the campus navigate through increasingly complicated legal environment.
I think every time I'm reminded of the work that your office does, it always brings to mind the idea that more people who are a part of our university community ought to be aware that you're here and the work you do. So my hope is after today we can have you back and other members of your staff and talk even more about university policy, because that in and of itself is probably an area with which most of us aren't as familiar as we ought to be. So
we'd be glad to do that. I mean, we want people to know what our policies are. It helps them, we hope, to do their jobs in an appropriate way, and we try to do the policies, write the policies in a way that it's understandable and clear what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and how to go about it in some cases.
Well, maybe in the course of our conversation here in the next few minutes, as we talk about a very specific university policy, which is Policy 702, which relates to weapons on campus, we can also remind ourselves through your words how this is representative of other policies as well. For instance, in the way it's written, and we'll go through that in just a minute. And if you have questions, you will see on your screen throughout our conversation here in the next few minutes how you can submit those questions to us, and I'll do my best to pose them to Dave Broome in the time we have. But let's talk a little bit about then the specific issue of weapons on campus. And I was reading that at least 19 states in this calendar year, have introduced legislation to allow concealed carry weapons on campuses. In many cases, we're talking about public university campuses. In some cases, we're talking public and private. And in North Carolina, a revision to our statute was adopted. It's passed, signed into law. That went into effect October 1st. And just yesterday, the UNC Charlotte Cabinet updated university policy that relates to weapons on campus. Right. So let's just set the basics of what we're talking about. We're talking about a weapon is permissible on campus, but you have to have a permit, a concealed carry permit, and the weapon itself has to be inside a vehicle in a locked compartment.
Almost.
Okay.
You're close.
What did I get wrong?
It has to be, if it's in a if it's in a locked vehicle, the container only has to be closed. The container need not be locked if the vehicle is locked.
Okay.
If the container is affixed to the vehicle, then it must be locked. And I believe what the legislature was getting at there, and the way we've written our policy, is if you have a pickup truck with a toolbox on the back, if that toolbox is affixed to your vehicle and locked, it could have a weapon in it. But if your weapon is inside the vehicle must be locked, and the weapon must be in a closed
container. All right. And now at the very basic level, we need to update our signs on campus then, right? And I was driving onto campus today, noticed we haven't done that yet.
They have been designed. I guess it's up to facilities management to get those done. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know the status of that. But yes, the signs.
And the language on those signs will now say something along the lines of?
No weapons on campus except as permitted by law.
Yeah. Okay.
So that is really always been the case, really. There are some other examples, some other exceptions in the statute and in our policy for allowing weapons. What we've been talking about is what's new in North Carolina, the idea that you could bring a weapon onto campus in your vehicle. There are, as maybe we'll see as we look at the policy, some other, one that comes to mind immediately is our law enforcement, our campus police carry weapons. That's an exception in the statute that allows them to do that.
Yeah.
So we have, and there are other things that are in the law that are also in our policy. This policy, we do policies in various ways. Some of them are pretty much our own policies that we craft to fit our own circumstances, such as a policy on where you can put signs, what permissions you need to put signs up on campus. There's really no statute that tells us how to do that. I mean, we deal with the First Amendment and we stay within those bounds, but this particular policy is our encapsulation of what the statutes say. We do it rather than just have a policy that says obey the statutes on weapons. That wouldn't tell people very much about what they should be doing because these statutes are complicated. They're very lengthy. They're in a couple of different places. Large chunks of the statute, the North Carolina law on weapons, doesn't apply to us. So we try to pull things together into one place. This actually all fits on one page.
Couldn't it also be the case that the university might in some way be liable if we didn't essentially restate or put a statute into the context of our environment, or wait, you didn't tell us that the state law or the United States Constitution says this.
I think if we didn't, it would be my job to say no, we're not liable. So I'm not going to admit here in this conversation that our failure to write a policy correctly leads to liability, but theoretically we could.
But absent
have
a policy,
well, if we don't have good policies on things, and then we try to enforce rules that we think are policies, but then the policies aren't very good, our disciplinary actions could be very difficult to carry forward because people would rightly be able to say, look, your policy didn't really do much of a job of telling me that what I was doing was outside the policy. Right. So we have to try to be as clear and direct as we can be.
And I think it's probably obvious, but let's go ahead and get out there that as we're talking about this particular issue, weapons on campus, it is not your role, it's not our role to really say anything about the merits of the idea. No. And I think all of us who are aware of the tragedies that have occurred in our country over the past several years, the tragedies that have occurred around the world when we're talking about troubled individuals with weapons who wreak mass destruction on campuses and in schoolyards. It's a horrible situation, and there are those who would argue, straight down the line of the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees us the right to bear arms. There were those who would argue, but we need tougher laws to, in an attempt to do away with weapons. There are plenty of others who would say, well, there's no way on earth you're going to do that. A troubled individual is going to get his or her hands on a weapon and do what they intend to do. Therefore, more of the rank and file citizenry should be armed. Now, let's not get into the merits of any of those arguments necessarily, but let's just say that we as an institution are in a position where we need to follow what the state tells us to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what we as university attorneys, that old cliche, I guess, you play the hand you're dealt. The statutes are what we have to work with, so we craft our policies and we advise our clients in accordance with what the law is. I mean, as you know, as you said, this area of the law is generates a lot of interest, generates a lot of argument on both sides, or a lot of sides. There aren't really just two sides. There are lots of angles to it. And this particular revision to the law generated a lot of comment from university officials, from campus police chiefs, from lobbyists for all sorts of organizations, and here's where it came out. So now that we have this, we have a policy that comports with the law, that tells the university community what the rules are in this area.
And let's go ahead and we'll go through some slides now that take us through the words that are in University Policy 702 that pertains to weapons on campus. And what I'd like to do, if it's not too much, is I'd like to just read this and have you tell me what we're seeing, what we should understand about it, and then along the way, particularly for those of us who might not be as familiar with the idea that we have several policies.
Nothing more interesting than reading the policies.
You know,
Love it.
might have something to do with the reader, but we'll get there. But, okay, so for starters, it's a violation of state criminal law and university policy to possess or carry any weapon as defined below, that's coming up, on the university campus, except as otherwise specifically provided by law. Violators will be referred for criminal prosecution, and faculty, staff, or student violations are also subject to university disciplinary action. So this establishes that we have a policy. It's talking about things that happen on campus, except otherwise specifically provided by law. This is what clears the way for law enforcement, or
and those exceptions, we've tried to catalog those and lay them out in the policy. We'll see those in a minute. They'll come up on the screen. But yes, that tells you something, that executive summary, but you really wouldn't know what you can and can't do just from that.
Okay, well, let's go on to the next page here. So as used within this policy, these are the terms that have the meanings provided below. The campus is all property owned or leased by UNC Charlotte. So to stop right there, this is all property owned or leased, meaning it's not just campus proper, but anywhere you're at a university facility,
right,
you're under our...
That's right. This is typical for our policies, that they don't apply just on the campus, but anywhere where the university is in charge of the facility. If we've leased it for a day or a week or a month, if we're in control of the premises, our policies are generally going to apply there.
And I've actually heard on a couple occasions at an event at Center City, maybe our officers aren't necessarily in plain view, but that is our jurisdiction as well.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. That's not somehow more Charlotte or different Charlotte than as we are here.
No,
right now
our officers are sworn officers, just like CMPD officers.
Yeah.
I mean, they have full law enforcement jurisdiction, and that is our property, and they have full authority to act there.
This next chunk in University Policy 702, the definition of a vehicle, a self-contained motorized passenger vehicle that may be entered, exited, and locked, such as a car or truck, and not including motorcycles, mopeds, or scooters, or non-motorized vehicles like bicycles.
So it's a fairly detailed and narrow description of what is a vehicle, and that becomes important because of one of the new parts of the law that allows weapons inside vehicles on campus. So if your vehicle doesn't fit this definition, then the exception that allows a weapon in or on the vehicle won't apply to your vehicle. So if you have one of these things, it's a moped or a scooter or a motorcycle, then this law didn't change anything about what you can do.
And what about a university employee who is taking a vehicle from the motor pool, a state vehicle?
Well, that's a really, really good question. The statute and let's see. In our policy, which we'll get to in a minute,
yes,
we talk about it being the person's vehicle.
right.
I don't believe the statute or our policy was intended to extend this exception to a vehicle that's not yours. In other words, that's the state's vehicle, not the person's vehicle.
Okay.
So my interpretation of the statute and our policy is that if, say you drive a state vehicle to your house, put a weapon in it, drive it back on campus, you're probably, I believe, outside the law and outside our policy.
Okay. And we can likely elaborate on that in a minute too when it comes up as we get deeper into policy 702 and a couple more screens. But the next chunk of language here defines weapon, which is any object or substance used, attempted to be used, or intended to inflict a wound, cause serious injury or incapacitate, including but not limited to firearms, explosive agents, chemicals, air or canister propelled guns, knives with blades over 4 inches, martial arts weapons, or any other weapon as defined by the state. So what doesn't that cover? Or what do you go home at night and say, what about...
Actually, there's hardly anything that doesn't cover under some circumstances. Now, there is a list of weapons in the statute that's referenced. We've tried to mention things that seem pretty obvious, firearms, some other things that are maybe, blades over 4 inches, that's clearly within our policy and within the statute. But there's a longer list. It's a little bit, analogous to the statutes on controlled substances, which change from time to time as chemists get more creative.
Right.
There could be weapons that aren't specifically mentioned here but are in a statute that would be covered. An interesting thing about the policy and about the law is it says an object or substance used or intended to inflict a wound. So this doesn't mention 2x4s or tree branches or coffee mugs. But if you use it, if you take something that's not a weapon and use it with the intention of inflicting a wound, you've turned it into a weapon and you've violated the policy. Now, you've got other problems besides violating University Policy 702. You might be...
you've just hurt somebody.
Yeah, you might have some other issues to deal with, but that's the way the policy works, is that we don't try to list every single thing that might be a weapon. That depends on... Some things are just because of what they are, firearms, et cetera, the things that, but other things can become weapons if you use them that way.
Sure. All right, well, we're digging through University Policy 702 pertaining to weapons on campus here on the Live Wire. And we're going to go now to the next big chunk of this university policy relating to the policy details. And it's a violation of state criminal law and university policy to possess or carry any weapon on the university campus except under the following circumstances: law enforcement personnel, firefighters, emergency service personnel, military personnel carrying out official duties. A registered armored car service guard or registered armed courier service guard with the permission of the university. I've seen them on campus before.
Right. Interestingly, I can't remember, a few years ago, turned out that was not in our policy. And we realized that we had people on campus with weapons who were not authorized. So we fixed our policy and we changed our contracts with the armored car services to make sure that it said you have permission to bring these weapons on campus. In fact, I think that was generated because they said they couldn't come on campus anymore because they'd been advised that they were not permitted to under our policies and under the contracts we had. So we fixed that. It's pretty important to have armored car service functioning on campus.
And ceremony educational uses, are we talking ROTC? Are we talking?
That could be that. I remember a particular situation where there was going to be I think it was a dance performance, and the outside group that was coming in used swords as part of the performance, and so we considered, they're here to, it's broadly educational for the campus community to be exposed to this particular sort of cultural activity. And so actually the Chancellor had to sign a letter saying, yes, you can use your swords as part of your performance.
So in another point of University Policy Understanding 101, when a policy says authorized by the Chancellor, is it the case that Chancellor Dubois sits at his desk and decides whether, or is it his designee who would be you?
No, I'm hardly ever the designee
Okay.
to actually take any administrative action.
Sure.
Lawyers don't like to get tied up in,
Okay.
in actually making decisions about administrative things.
Okay.
We give legal advice, and in that particular case, it was in fact the Chancellor, because that hadn't been delegated. He theoretically could delegate that authority to some other appropriate official, but it's not, that's not the way the lawyers work usually.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and he's a fairly hands-on kind of a leader, so I could imagine he wants to be on top of all this kind of thing that involves university policy. So, a handgun on the premises of a residence of a university employee whose residence is a detached single-family dwelling on campus. Do we really have that on our
Bissell House, where the
Okay.
Chancellor lives, is for most purposes considered to be on campus.
Okay.
So that is the only place that part of the statute and our policy would apply, would be the
Sure.
Chancellor's residence.
Okay. But if, for instance, we had some form of,
Care-
you know,
a caretaker,
Sure.
say we own some property
yeah,
at a remote location and we had a person housed on that property to keep an eye on it,
yeah.
it would apply there.
You know, in the old days, on some campuses, you would find spaces they would call, for instance, married student housing or something along those lines. But that's usually more like an apartment style thing, not a detached
And it has to be
single-family dwelling.
a
so.
detached residence, and the person living there has to be a university employee. And
Okay.
so,
All right, and then finally in this section,
but actually, that's an interesting question. If we had such a place, if we
Yeah.
had detached housing for married students, and that student also was a university employee,
all of which starts to sound feasible.
yeah, but does the statute really mean that the employee is in that residence because of the employment relationship, or does it just mean that
Right.
they happen to be an employee who happens to live in a detached house on campus? We don't have that case, but it's a good law exam question.
And what if they had a second job for Brinks driving an armored truck? Okay.
Okay.
Just checking. All right. So a person who has a legally valid concealed handgun permit, or who is exempt from obtaining such a permit under state law, who has a handgun in a closed compartment or container within the person's locked vehicle or in a locked container securely affixed to the person's vehicle. The person may unlock the vehicle to enter or exit the vehicle, provided the handgun remains in closed compartment at all times, et cetera, et cetera. That's complicated, isn't it?
It is.
Purposely?
I don't know if it's not purposely on our part.
But-
Our purpose was to try to capture what the statute
mirroring the
requires. This is
statute, yeah.
almost
Word for
exactly
word.
the statutory language,
Yeah.
but that is those last two that we read about, a weapon in a detached residence on campus, and this one, those are the new parts of the law. That's what changed in the last session of the legislature, and that's what we're working through right now. So yeah, there are a lot of as you can see, there are complications here, and what it all means would ultimately be sorted out in court if someone were charged with having a weapon on campus without fitting into one of the exceptions. Then we would know at that point, depending on how that case came out, if our policy squares up, if we understand what the legislature meant, depending on how that trial went.
Well, I think just taking this time as we're doing to go through this policy hopefully has the effect on people who have thought, well, now you can have guns on campus. You know,
No.
not
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, yeah, in fact, you're not even, allowed to get it out of your vehicle
Yeah.
on campus.
Yeah.
You can have it there, but if you see someone walking around on campus with a weapon who's not an officer, not a Brinks guard, they're probably not authorized to have that weapon.
Now you're
on campus.
You are a legal professional. You're a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a typical approach in a statute in any way? I mean, to me, I would, and I'm certainly no lawyer, but I would say, why did we bother with this? What does this do or solve or advance or really change?
I mean,
And
I didn't look very much into the background of why this was enacted. I hear some anecdotal situations, like on some campuses, people working late shifts, getting off in the middle of the night. Maybe they have to drive through a bad neighborhood.
Yeah.
The thought was those people need weapons in their cars, or they should be able to have one if they want one, not because of what's going on the campus so much as getting to and from work. Maybe they're in places where they feel the need to have some protection. There may be that might be a apocryphal story, or it might be true, and there might be other reasons for this statute, but like I said, I haven't looked too much into the background. We're more involved with, now we've got it, how do we deal with it?
Yeah. And in other conversations that we will continue to have, and particularly when we invite Chief Baker,
Mm-hmm.
we have the opportunity to have discussions about campus safety
Right.
in particular. And I think for the most part, we are regarded as doing pretty well. And we
Right.
have,
I mean, our office would always defer to Chief Baker and his professionals for advice and for understanding of where the appropriate balance is between safety and freedom of, Second Amendment things. I mean, they would be the ones that would know the best about what keeps our community safest.
yeah. Well, I hope, and we'll wind up here in just another couple minutes, but I hope that those of you who are watching today with Dave Broome find this interesting. I find it interesting to stop, take a minute, and actually go through this policy in particular, but I think we want to have you back and members of your staff to do a little bit more digging into university
Sure.
policy, because it's important to be aware of it, and it's important to understand what it says and what it doesn't say. And I think in this case, there are probably some folks who might realize that the weapons on campus policy doesn't necessarily say what they might have thought it said. So, but as another point of advice here, we'll put up on the screen the website of Legal Affairs. And when you go by the acronym, is it OLA or OLE, as in great approval and happiness here?
It's usually just OLA or Legal Affairs,
All
but we'll answer to just.
OLA.
We have answered to just about everything.
All right. But this site clearly introduces us to the members of your staff. And then also, over here on the left-hand column, if you click on university policies, you get an update of some of the recent changes to university policy. And then you can really dig in on your own for your own recreational reading
Mm-hmm.
and really get into it, which may or may not be a good thing to do, but if you want to call it recreation, but it is certainly something that's
Right.
informative.
Right. I hope they're organized well. We've those of us who've been around the university for a while will probably remember when all the policies were just numbered, 1 through 120 or 130 something. And Amy Kelso in particular, but the whole office in general, has worked pretty hard over an extended period of time to organize the policies into something that might make it a little easier to find them, a little more comprehensible about what the policy is getting at, what general areas are being dealt with, and so we hope that that would be useful to folks.
Great.
The campus is, we don't, as you know, maybe from discussions in cabinet, we're moving into a time when compliance, universities are very heavily regulated, more so than almost any. I mean, we're the regulation that applies to universities is equivalent to healthcare regulation or banking regulation. It's very intense, and there's a lot of it.
And even more so for a research university.
Right. And so we're entering an era where corporate entity-wide compliance is important. And that doesn't mean all we worry about are following rules, but we try to engender a culture of ethics, of understanding our role as employees here, as officers of the university, and just knowing what our policies are, generally at least, knowing that following those is going to be in the university's best interest, in your own personal best interest, is important. And so there's going to be more and more emphasis on that, more and more training to help people understand what those rules are, how their jobs relate to the bigger community. And so discussions along these lines, I hope, are helpful to folks.
Well, and maybe just a final thought, and this might be not an easy answer, but why wouldn't it work for general administration to simply say, here's a set of policies, they apply to all of the member institutions of the UNC system, have at it, go, here's your roadmap. I mean, why do we need our own team on campus and our own policies?
Well, there are, I think, some very good reasons for that. And general administration, the Board of Governors do have a healthy set of regulations. That's part of the regulatory environment in which we operate. The first thing that comes to mind is tenure. There's a very lengthy Board of Governors policy on tenure and how the tenure process should work. What are some of the basic protections for faculty members who have or are trying to attain tenure? But within that, there's a recognition that the University of North Carolina at Charlotte has its own mission, has its own campus culture, that we're different from NC State or UNC Chapel Hill. We're different from Elizabeth City State. We're different from UNC Wilmington. We want to develop a certain type of faculty. We want to have an understanding of our own about what it means to be a faculty member at UNC Charlotte. So within the broad framework that General Administration and the Board of Governors gives us with regard to tenure, we develop many other rules and processes for how we're going to look at tenure questions. We have a university policy on that. I would venture to say, I know all the colleges have their own rules and processes for reviewing tenure questions. Departments, I think, generally have their own. So the idea of trying to impose one culture on 16 or 17 different campuses in the UNC system, I don't think that's very palatable. I don't think the folks in Chapel Hill really think that they would be able to say to each one of the campuses, this rule is one size fits all, so follow it. They understand that we are all different. We all have different histories, we have different missions, we have different aspirations. We're growing in different ways, we're focused in different ways. So we have to have our own ways of getting within the broad framework to the place we're going. So there aren't many areas where we just have a general administration policy and then everybody just says,
Sure.
Yeah, that's our policy.
Sure. Well, again, I hope that those of you who've been with us here on the Live Wire have found this informative, and I would like to invite you back and members of your staff back throughout the year and have more conversations about specific university policies, and we can pick out some of the good ones,
Okay.
or whatever.
There are some good ones.
But
We
whatever,
can do that.
the big ones
Yeah.
that come up
Yeah.
from time to time. And then
Sure.
if you who are watching have some requests, you'd like to have more of a conversation about any of the specific university policies, go out on that Office of Legal Affairs website and take a look at the scope, the breadth, the depth of the policies that we have here at UNC Charlotte, and send us a note. Say, hey, why don't you have a discussion about this one or that one, and we'll do it. So for now, thank you for being a part of our audience today, and look forward to more clips on YouTube from today's conversation. And we thank once again Dave Broome, Vice Chancellor for Legal Affairs and General Counsel at UNC Charlotte, for being with us today, and we'll look forward to having you back.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It was
All right.
fun.
Good. All right.